So, in honor of watching this episode of The Acolyte, I decided to wear the perfect shirt. I dare say it's a Star Trek Lower Decks reference. Hello there, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. Apologies for that very dumb Star Trek Star Wars crossover joke. If you watch Star Trek Lower Decks, you'll get the shirt. If you don't, it will go completely by you. But regardless, we are here to review the latest episode of Star Wars The Acolyte, the penultimate episode of Season 1. This episode titled Choice. And I have to say, I think all of us who are watching this show in earnest feel that this episode, going into it with it being the return to the flashback sequence that we got back in episode, I believe, 3, that this one was going to carry a lot of weight because so much emphasis has been placed on not only the backstory, but the revelations and context that this episode continually was promising us, as Soul continually referred to it throughout the past few episodes, saying like, I'm definitely going to tell you what really happened that night. And a lot of the trauma and mystery and anger that a lot of characters are feeling and wondering about, and we're wondering about as the audience, really rested on the revelations that happened in this episode. And I was also very concerned because we kind of got a lot of information way back in the first episode of the flashbacks, episode 3, and I was worried that by having a sort of Rashomon kind of story that the failures of the series so far would become very evident in this episode, in so much that there would be a lot of repetition, a lot of clunkiness, a lot of added dialogue, it just taking forever to get to the point. And I say all of that preamble about feelings going into this episode, just with my expectations being in a weird place of like knowing this episode had to carry a lot, but also my feelings on this show being very, let's just say, frustrated on the whole. So that when I say I actually really, really liked this episode and think for the most part it actually pulled off what it was trying to do and actually made me feel like, oh, I'm actually intrigued and interested in not only the story but where it's attempting to go in the final episode of this season, that is no small feat. That is absolutely no small feat on this episode. Now, I will caveat that this is far from my perfect episode. I have pretty substantial issues, but for the most part, they do not bring down my overall feeling of this episode actually pulling off what it was attempting to do. So let's talk about why I think it ultimately worked. And I think that it is mainly because the episode smartly focuses in on Soul's perspective. If episode 3 was mainly told from Osha's perspective, this one is very much Soul's, and maybe even a little bit of May's in there as well for a couple different moments and beats, but really Soul's. And within that, we kind of get to see who Soul was at this point in time. That is distinct from who we have gotten to know him to be in the present timeline of the show, and see the failures and his own problems and his own insecurities and his own projections that led to everything that has come after this point. And it actually, the episode manages to do that with actually very nuanced, depthful writing, which is not something that I think I can say a lot about this show. And I think a lot of it comes down to just, again, how Soul's perspective is shown. We get sort of a good arc for him in the episode where we see at the beginning of the episode as Indara sort of confronts him with, after he sort of gives this information to Torben, where Torben is wanting to get off of Coruscant, and Soul sort of says, oh, we're looking for this, I forget what it's called, a vergence, and this sort of like very powerful force point that caused life to be on this planet. And also, by the way, I did catch the quick little like reference reference to the High Republic books. For those of you who don't know, the first ever book in the High Republic series, the only one that I read, starts off with a hyperspace accident that causes like rocks and things to fall onto planets, destroying them throughout the galaxy. Presumably that was the incident that they were referring to at the beginning of this episode that caused this planet initially to be lifeless. So I like that little small High Republic book connection there. That was a lot of fun. But yeah, we see him, Soul, sort of giving the answers and sort of pushing someone in a direction that he wants them to get to without getting them there, without them getting there themselves. And he does that for Torben. And ultimately, that is the central character flaw that pushes every single scene that Soul is in. And I really liked giving more context to some of the scenes that we got in episode 1, where we clearly see how Soul, even unintentionally, and it very much comes across as not intentional, or let me put it differently, not a conscious decision, maybe intentional subconsciously, but him trying to push things to get to the outcome that he wants. He felt a connection to Osha. So he, for example, when we go and see the Mai's training segment, or test segment from episode 3, that we didn't get in episode 3, I should say. And we see that how it just would have played normally and May would have failed the test. And then how Soul says, I want to do it my way. And how he, in the scene that we do see from episode 3, where we see Osha's test, how a lot of that was him kind of manipulating Osha's view and desires. Because he knows that she wants to escape this planet. And he kind of pushes her to that outcome. And even kind of lies to her. Like at one point he says, there's this line that gets recontextualized where he says, you have to say what you want and go for what you want and desire what you want. But that's actually not how the Jedi work. And it's what Torben is not able to do under his own master. Indara quite literally says you have to just learn to kind of do things that you don't want to do, and that's actually kind of what led Torben to be manipulated by the sister mother at one point, because he sort of fell to dark side in the sense that dark side represents passion, desire, wants, and not just like evil and fear, but like passion and desire. And as a result of that, he lies to Osha about what the Jedi are and what she should be to get it and what it would mean to her in order to get the outcome that he wants. And Indara sees it, and it's played so well, especially by Carrie-Anne Moss, and you see this weight on her. And it was, again, such a really cool recontextualization of her, because you would have thought coming into this episode that she was going to be the dick. She was going to be the asshole who pushes things to get what she wants. And in the scenes that we got from Osha's perspective way back in episode 3, that's kind of how she's seen as, because that she's the leader of the group. She kind of puts up this face to the sisters and to Osha of being this sort of distant teacher and Jedi and someone who's confrontational, but you see at every point behind the scenes that she is trying to be understanding, is trying to hold back. I think there's a really beautiful moment that Soul sort of says they put a dark mark onto dark mark, bad choice of words for numerous reasons for me, but anyways, they put a marking onto May, and it sort of marked her with dark side power. And no, I love that Indara's putting ceremonial marks on people is something that cultures do. You're sort of vilifying this thing that is somewhat normal in many cultural practices. And it's she's right. She's absolutely right. She's actually being respectful of their civilization. It is Soul who is projecting this sort of feeling onto her. It's just very well done. And I also love that when we saw, for example, Indara and the Jedi show up in episode 3, they were presented as this team's we've come for your children, essentially. But we see behind the scenes that Indara's I should just go by myself, because then I would seem less of a threat. And you're right. Them all showing up did seem threatening in episode 3. I remember when that happens, whoa, these guys just showing up and it was presented in this threatening manner. But in reality, and that's how they would perceive it. But in reality, she wasn't trying to be. She was trying to just come in and be hey, we're just concerned about some things. But you can also see how the sisters sort of you're an institutional power. You're coming in here with the power of the state that we don't belong to, nor do we wish to belong to. And you're trying to project your shit onto us and take our kids. which is absolutely what they're doing, but it's under Soul's instigation because he is projecting what he wants onto the situation and the outcome that he wants. And that is ultimately portrayed in the sequence where he literally has to choose between May and Osha, and he chooses Osha, letting May fall at the end. And I love that we didn't get that in the other episode because Osha was focused on May. She was focused on watching her, and she missed that Soul made a choice because she was a kid and she doesn't remember it that way. I thought I just thought all the ways that this episode added new context to not only the story, but also where Soul and Indara's perspectives were in it, was really, really, really good. And finally gets to what I've wanted this series to do because it's wanted to do this, I think, for many episodes, and at times it really hits it very well. Like in episode, I think 5, where you have Kamir saying to Soul, like, you're the one that brought that kid here. You're the one that put her in danger. I killed her, but like, you're the one that put her in this situation. She didn't have to be. That's you. And I think that's interesting. But then we get things like last episode where his Kamir's viewpoint is just very shallow and not very interesting to me. Whereas here we get to see some presentation of the dark side as being about passion, being about caring. Like it is much more nuanced and better in ways that I really liked. I'm going to now talk about my negatives on this episode because I do not think it was perfect, and then I'll end on some more positives. Biggest negative for me of this episode is Torben. There are elements that I think the pieces are in place for him to be fine. He has this desire of wanting to go back to Coruscant, and to a degree, I get this element of like, he's a kid, he's a teenager, he's bored, he doesn't want to be here, he wants to be doing something better and more important in his eyes, not searching for some random thing off on some planet. Like, he's a kid, and I get that impulse. It's kind of the same impulse that Anakin kind of has in Clone Wars era of like, I want to do something cool, and he's stuck, protecting Padme, but then that's a whole other thing. But this like impulsive nature of youth that the Jedi try to stymie and stop and don't let kids be kids, that's coming out in Torben's sort of rebelliousness here. And so I can buy that, but it's presented, I don't know, very shallowly. Like, for example, at one point he just sort of like runs off when he's like, we can find proof, we can get off this planet, I need to go get them. And it just like seems to happen very quickly for the plot rather than feeling kind of naturally coming out of what Torben wanted. And what I feel I needed is just a little bit more reason for why Torben want to go back to Coruscant. Like, I buy this whole thing about like teenager wants to be where the cool stuff's happening, wants to go back to the city, doesn't want to be hanging out with like in the middle of nowhere. Get that. But I don't know. I feel like it needed like a little bit of something. This is not a good example because the Jedi don't have girlfriends. Though maybe it could have been a way to like question the institution of power, but like show that like Torben has someone he cares about or has a girlfriend or a boyfriend back on Coruscant. Like a little like he calls somebody and says like, oh, it could be, or like, I mean, that would be an interesting way because Jedi don't have like romantic partners. It would have been an interesting way to say like, hey, he's a youth, he's kind of rebelling against the institution of the Jedi. Maybe that would be a little bit too far for the series. I could understand that. But you could say that, hey, look, teenagers rebel a little bit even when they like want to sort of fit into the, the hegemony that they're a part of. Maybe he would. Maybe he grew out of it. Maybe it's a little thing that you're like, he is a kid. Maybe you do that. You experiment by having a monogamous relationship and then you become chaste. That sort of thing. That would have been an interesting thing to add to like the history of the Jedi. Or you could have just done something simpler if you didn't want to go that deep down the well, because that would have been a whole other, thing to kind of deal with. Do something like, hey, my best buds in the Jedi Council, my other favorite, not Jedi Council, like my other best buds, Padawans, are getting to do the cool stuff back home. I heard my friend Steve the Jedi, he got to go like, do stuff with the military or something, like just like something that would like feel like there's a better like push for him to want to get back to Coruscant, because he's already been there for 7 weeks, and so this like burning desire that makes him headstrong at certain points, it feels a little bit shallow to me, in ways that I this read a little bit more like, oh, the plot's trying to get to happen here. And the other big element to me is the confusion over what the hell that like the misty thing that the mother does at one point, that leads to her getting stabbed by Soul. Like, she becomes this mist, and then Soul stabs her, and I can buy in a moment of like Soul, like, oh, she's doing something, I gotta stab her, oh god, I'm fearful, and that like plays into like Soul sort of like, he sees what he wants to see. He sees these people as dark side users, as evil, so he's more willing to stab her than he would be if he had sort of been more like, you know, like more like pulled back. But I because the context of what that ability is very nebulous, I was like, why did she choose to do that then? It made her look really dumb and felt weird to me. It's just a weird moment, just given not having enough information there. We get a little bit more later on where the other mother, she also does the same thing, and presumably she's like possessing the Wookiee, and then the rest of the witches are like helping control it. But the rules are, I'm trying to guess at it, and the rules are never very clear. And for something so important in the history of the story of Soul killing May and Osha's mother, I would like to have a better, clear indication of why she was doing that and what was happening, rather than me kind of having to headcanon a little bit. Because otherwise, you know, I can make it work in my head, but I have to make it work in my head. Like, it pulls me out of the moment that should be a really powerful moment, to have me think about like, wait, what was happening here? When I should just be feeling like, oh my gosh, Soul killed her mother. But now I'm just thinking like, she looks kind of dumb. What was she trying to do? I guess that kind of makes sense, but it's a little weird. It just doesn't land, I think, in the way that it wants to land because of that. And so I found that to be a little bit weaker. The other element of that too, that I found kind of silly was, you have all of the witches controlling the Wookiee. I forget his name. Started with a K. Anyway, but the Wookiee Jedi. And it was awesome to finally get the payoff for the Jedi Wookiee that I think a lot of people were frustrated that we hadn't been getting. Like, we saw him once really quickly, I think in episode 2, and then he was dead by episode 4 or something. And so it was like, oh, we didn't get to pay off of that Wookiee. Like, I would have liked to see that. And now here we do. So, like, finally, you know, if you have a Wookiee with a lightsaber in the first act, you gotta fire it off by the third act, as they say. So I did like that fight, but the witches controlling him and then Indara stopping him, using some cool Trinity abilities, loved that. But stopping him, and then they all just sort of faint and presumably die? In the fire? Unclear. Felt again a little bit forced to, like, I guess we need to genocide all these sisters, so this will be a way to do it, and it's in a way that doesn't make the Jedi look totally awful, like they genocided a whole group of people. And it's just like, really, it kills them all? They all get knocked out and blown up in that fire? It just like it just feels weird of that, this power working this way. In a way that just knocks them all out. It just felt a little forced to make plot happen. Again, I can maybe buy the power, because a Jedi presumably would have a lot of mental fortitude, so it would probably take a few sisters to, you know, stop him from control him, I should say. And then Indara adding on top of that would just weaken them all. Like, I can buy it, but it just feels a little, just the fact that it gets all of them. And they all die. It just feels a little forced to me. Again, a lot of these negatives that I have are things that I'm like, it could have been ironed out with a little, like, if this script had a little bit more time in the oven, like a few more scenes, like, even if it's really just adding like a scene or two of like Torben's desires and maybe explaining what's going on with these powers a little bit more. Overall, I think really could have just smoothed out my issues and made this a top-notch, like, A+ story for me. So while I have those negatives, though, the overall, like, crux of what this is trying to do, which is adding interesting context to what happened, Soul's characterization, and also Indara's characterization as well, and, like, the history going on here, I think worked really, really well, and ultimately makes this succeed for me, and adds a lot of nuance to stuff that I had felt was pretty shallow up until this point. The last thing that I will end on, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I want to call out. there's probably a couple things here and there, but the major big thing that I do want to call out, second to last thing I want to call out, and I'll call it the last thing, the fire. A lot of people were sort of talking about the fire in episode 3 of like, oh, that fire seemed to start very quickly. We just sort of saw it from outside the windows, like, oh, I guess May just started a fire, and it, like the whole thing started going up into flames. We get a little bit more context for that, so hopefully that criticism people will appreciate more, but like she was actually just burning the Jedi book that Osha had, and then it sparked everything else up. Still feels a little like, oh wow, the fire just caught very, very quickly, but I can also buy like a kid doing that, like that happens. I worked in a Boy Scout camp for several years. I did see boys doing stupid things that led to fires possibly getting out of control and were only stopped by adults that were nearby with fire buckets. So like, been there. So I get it. Just again, it was one of those like it made it better than it was. Still felt like this very rock like ground is setting on fire very quickly. Like I was just surprised that a rock floor would ignite that quickly. The electronics, 100% buy that. The floor, weird. So yeah, that little better, but still not perfect sort of element there. But this does lead me to the end of the episode, which I loved, which is initially Indara, says to Soul, like, you need to lie and say that May was the one to set the fire and it's all her fault. And when that started to happen, I'm like, really, Indara? You're the one that's kind of been on like, Soul, you've been fucking up this entire time. So it felt a little out of character for Indara until she said it wasn't to protect Soul, it was to give Osha a future. Because if Soul stepped down, if he took the brunt of this, if he admitted it was all his fault, then not only would Osha not have a passionate advocate for her to join the Jedi Council at her age, but also it would sort of like decrease her chances just overall, considering what happened and the Jedi wanting to sort of avoid, acknowledging it in any way, and sort of the shame of that and be involved in it in any way. So this way it frames it as like the Jedi should have done something, and the way they can make up for it is by helping Osha, and then Soul can still advocate for her because he's there. And Indara saying like that's the only way this works, and like if you take the blame like you should, you'll take this dream from this girl. So everything that happened here, the deaths of all of these people, will have been literally for nothing. At least this way we can give her something. And what's the tragedy of it is that we ultimately know that Osha does end up kicked out of the Jedi regardless, that she doesn't fit in there, that she never really gets to exist in that world in the way that she wanted to for numerous reasons. It wasn't built for her because, she was too old at the time. And I think that kind of interesting, thinking about it now too, that is interesting considering, it's something I picked up on earlier, but like, the fact that they cast Osha as a black woman, and, you can talk about how institutions of power in the United States, for example, they will sometimes accommodate people of color, but they were not built for them. And as a result, like there's systemic racism, and, people of color are less able to get ahead often. Certainly there'll be some that people will point to like, look, they picked themselves off their bootstraps, but ultimately these institutions are systemically keeping people down. And that kind of seems what happened with Osha in a metaphorical sense, because obviously the same sort of racism based on, skin color is less prevalent, or at least doesn't exist in the same way as it does in, our Earth-based society. But racism does exist in Star Wars, lest you forget that, just not in the same way. Speciesism is often more the case, but it is akin to that. So yeah, I think that ending was very powerful and added a lot of context. So on the whole, like I said, I have my issues with this episode, but it is a strong entry and adds a lot of greater context and a lot more nuance to a lot of the things that I felt have been very shallow about this show so far. This is what I wanted this show to do, and I think at times the show can do it, and when it does it, it's really, really good. But I think ultimately, maybe I'll sort of like talk about this more when the season wraps out, but I think, judging by this episode, I think the problem is just pacing. That there's clearly a lot of interesting ideas that this show has, but it is unwilling to, build them all fast enough. And wants to sort of be like, oh, look, we have mysteries. What are the mysteries? And as a result of them holding back the mysteries, it's kind of just frustrating to watch at times because we have to pace out the plot beats of it, and withhold the mysteries, and so we can't do the full explorations of these ideas. And some of you in the comments may probably go and be like, well, that's part of a show. It explores the ideas as it goes. But really, I like shows that are, when they're better developed, where like the ideas seem to evolve as we go along, whereas this show seems to be just holding back, exploring those ideas so the plot beats can catch up, so they can have their big revelations. And when those revelations happen, then it can go, and now we'll explore those ideas that you've been waiting for us to get to. And it feels a little bit more frustrating. So I think the show probably works better watched as a whole, as most shows do generally. But I really feel like this is one that, honest to God, the week-to-week watching of it, I think might have hindered this a little bit more than if it had been like a binge model. I think, so most of the time I prefer watching things week to week, but every once in a while there's shows that I do think work better when you binge them, as like reading a whole book instead of reading chapter by chapter. That's ultimately my thoughts on this episode. A really solid one, has me much more interested and excited going into the finale. There's still a lot for the finale to do, especially involving Khmer and all that stuff. But this episode has me at least a little bit more intrigued that they will at least do something interesting with it and make me feel like there's some payoff rather than just leaving me frustrated like most of the rest of the season has. So what did you think about this one? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. But beyond all that, my friends, I hope y'all live long and prosper.